Good evening and welcome to NRAS Facebook Live. I'm delighted to be joined here this evening by Professor Gareth Jones from the University of Aberdeen, Professor of Epidemiology. So I'm going to hand over to you, Gareth, to explain what does that mean, and then you're going to share some slides on the PSA register, the Biologics Register for the psoriatic arthritis. So over to you, Gareth.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So yes, I'm a professor of epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of diseases, the causes, determinants of disease in the population. So think epidemiology, epidemic. So prior to 2020, not many people had heard of epidemiologists, but over the last 2 years, we've been getting top billing because of the pandemic. Although I should point out, I don't work in infectious diseases. So I work in the epidemiology group at the University of Aberdeen. We study arthritis and musculoskeletal pain, and have had a program studying arthritis and pain going back a number of years. Now we also look at other common symptoms, things like fatigue, and we're particularly interested also in work outcomes, and are one of the major centres in the Centre for Musculoskeletal Health and Work, funded by Versus Arthritis and the Medical Research Council. All our work, we try and lead from one thing to another. We conduct observational studies to try and identify what causes diseases. We then undertake clinical trials to try and test new management for certain conditions. These tend to be non-pharmacological trials, so looking at things like exercise and cognitive behavioral therapy for fibromyalgia, for example. And we've got a recently started program looking at health services research and how do we design healthcare services for patients. So I've got a couple of slides to share. I'll just do that. Okay, so if I've done that correctly, you should now be looking at my my slides. What I'd like to talk about briefly this evening is the disease registers from the British Society for Rheumatology. What have we learnt and where next? So first of all, I just want to have a couple of minutes really talking about why have disease registers in the first place. So to do that, if we just think, to start off, we think about drug development. Obviously, this is done by large pharmaceutical companies. And when a new molecule is identified that might be of potential benefit as a medicine, after it's undergone a number of laboratory tests, and so it's tested in what's called first-in-man studies. And actually, normally they probably are in men as well, but only a very small number of very often healthy volunteers, sometimes 10, sometimes 20 people. After they've identified there's no really strong safety signals, they've identified that the drug seems to be safe, they undertake a number of clinical trials in patient populations. And this is still actually relatively small numbers of individuals, in the hundreds, certainly, possibly the low thousands. And after a number of trials, the drug has been demonstrated to be safe and effective. It has to undergo approval process before it's given its license. After that point, the drug is prescribed by consultants for whatever patients they deem appropriate, as long as it's within the license. But one of the problems is that these early studies, prior to the drug getting its license, as I said, very early are healthy volunteers. The clinical trials tend to be done in highly selected patients. What do I mean by that? These are patients that come from specialist centres where consultants or professors have specific academic interest. Many of the trials are actually conducted in the same centres. But what happens when the drug is received its license is it can be given to older patients, younger patients, patients with comorbidities, patients that have had various previous treatments, patients that are perhaps difficult to treat, have failed a number of existing treatments. And these patients are often excluded from the clinical trials. So one of the things we did is we took some patients from one of our registers who were starting some of these new drugs, and we compared them to patients in the clinical trials to see, well, actually, how do they differ? So this is data from our actual spondyloarthritis register. We had nearly 2,500 patients, over 800 of whom were starting biologic therapy, starting a TNF inhibitor, either Humira, Enbrel, or Cimzia. And we found that actually only 2/5, so just 41% of patients in our study who were commencing these drugs actually would have been included in any of the trials that led to the licensing of these drugs. We also looked at how effective the drugs were. We looked at treatment response using what's called an ASAS-20 measure. What it's called, it doesn't really matter. This is a composite response criteria based on patient global assessment of disease, but also looking at pain and function and a measure of inflammation. And we found that while in the trials, 62% of people met this treatment response criteria, in the BSR-BRAS, so in our register patients, only 51%. So why is it then that fewer people in the real world were responding to these drugs than in the clinical trials? Well, the truth is we don't know, but we were able to establish that the patients were different. In the register, patients were more likely to be female, they were slightly older, and even though their disease activity was similar, they had lower levels of function. So we know that patients in clinical trials are different from patients in the real world. So what can we do about it? Well, one thing we can do is we can put the licensing later. We can delay it. We can insist on much more clinical research before a drug is given a license. But the problem with this then is the number of patients who are unable to benefit from these new medicines for quite a lot longer. So the other thing we can do is put the license, leave it where it is, if you like, don't play with the timelines, and then conduct post-authorization research. In other words, carry on researching these medicines after they're being used in clinical practice. And this allows us to answer questions such as, well, what is the effectiveness of these drugs in routine clinical care? But also to look at things like, can we predict treatment response? Can we identify in advance people who will respond to treatment or not? Does treatment effectiveness differ in different patient groups, men and women, for example, or old and young? We can look at the effect of comorbidities. Do people who have other conditions, does their treatment response differ? We can look at other outcomes, such as occupational outcomes. Trials very, very seldom report on occupational outcomes. And we can look at things like drug retention, how long people stay on these drugs. So I'm going to talk a little bit now just about the BSR registries. The BSR has 4 registries. The BSR, I should say, British Society for Rheumatology, has 4 registries. One in rheumatoid arthritis, one in juvenile idiopathic arthritis, and both of these are run from a group at the University of Manchester, led by Professor Kimi Heinrich. And then led from the University of Aberdeen, there's a register on psoriatic arthritis and a register on ankylosing spondylitis. So briefly to talk about the RA and the JIA registers, only briefly, I said, because I'm not the best place to talk about it. Someone from Manchester would be far better able to summarize this work. But it's been going, the RA register certainly has been going for about 20 years now, and they've produced over 100 scientific papers. Just to give you a flavor of some of them, so this is one of the very early papers looking at serious infection. They concluded that in patients with active rheumatoid arthritis, anti-TNF therapy, so biologic therapy, was not associated with an increased risk of overall serious infection compared with DMARD treatment. So DMARDs being your methotrexates, your sulfasalazines, and so on. They've looked at joint replacement. They found overall no association between the use of TNF inhibitors and subsequent risk of joint replacement, but there was a relative reduction in total hip replacement rates among older patients. They've looked at laboratory factors and various genetic factors identified in this paper here, 7 new genetic markers associated with response to biologic therapy. And then finally, one from the juvenile idiopathic arthritis register, showing that etanercept therapy was associated with improvement in height over the first 2 years of therapy. So now moving to talk about the Aberdeen-based registers. I should point out the axial spondyloarthritis register. This is one of the Aberdeen ones. This is the only one of the 4 registers for the BSR that's no longer ongoing, or certainly no longer collecting data. We are still analysing it. We recruited patients from 2012 to 17, and follow-up finished about 6 months later. And we had just under 2,500 patients. So again, just to give you a flavour of the analysis that we've conducted, we tried to identify whether it was possible to identify patients in advance who are going to respond to treatment. Again, thinking about TNF inhibitors, so your Enbrels, your Humiras, and so on. We identified a number of modifiable factors, such as disease activity and mental health, but also a number of non-modifiable factors. And we found that people who had lower socioeconomic class, but also people who had various comorbidities, such as fibromyalgia. If you had comorbid fibromyalgia, although some improvement in your disease was seen, it was not, the biologic therapy did not bring you down to the level of the patients without fibromyalgia. Quality of life is, of course, very important. And so can we predict those people who have poor quality of life? Poor disease activity, poor levels of function, of course, these are important. But we also showed that aspects of mental health, people who had sleep disturbance, people who had activity impairment, fibromyalgia, people who smoked, were more likely to have poor quality of life than just those who had the poorer disease. And we looked at fatigue, another very important symptom for patients. We found that TNF inhibitors, these biologic drugs, do result in a modest reduction in fatigue. And we found that those who have poor sleep quality are most likely to improve. But again, it wasn't a complete, it wasn't the same effect as seen in those without fatigue. And so I think it's important to consider not only these biological medicines, but also consider other management strategies as well. And we did a number of analyses looking at work. We wanted to see, ultimately, can we identify in advance those people who go on to lose their job because of their disease? Of course, this is enormous importance to patients, and not only in terms of esteem, but in terms of quality of life, in terms of supporting family, and so on. And we found that the people who lost their job next year were those who are most likely to have job absence this year. Perhaps that's not so much a surprise. But we were also able to show that people who were likely to be absent this year were likely to be those who were reporting lower productivity this year. So low productivity plus people having a labor-intensive job or a manual job, plus having peripheral disease, so also arthritis in the hands, for example. But we were even able to predict that. So people who have high disease activity, high levels of fatigue, again, the labor-intensive job, and people who have poor function today are likely to be the ones who have decreased productivity tomorrow. So it seems to be this cascade, or this roadmap, if you like, where we can identify really quite early people who are at increased risk of job loss. And being able to identify them early, which means that it's possible to start considering management strategies and support for these individuals. And lastly, I want to talk about the psoriatic arthritis register and give a bit of a plug for the psoriatic arthritis register. This is the only one that's based in Aberdeen that's still recruiting patients. So psoriatic arthritis is a unique clinical challenge. I've heard Professor McInnes from the University of Glasgow talk about PSA on a number of occasions, and he always reminds people this is not just rheumatoid arthritis with a rash. Psoriatic arthritis has synovitis, so inflammation of the synovium around the joints. Psoriatic arthritis, so psoriasis rather, inflammation of the skin. Enthesitis, inflammation where tendons meet bones. dactylitis, so this can be swelling of entire digits, but also there's nail disease, comorbidities. So obesity is common, metabolic disorder, adverse mental health. These are all common. There are a number of rheumatology registers that already include patients with psoriatic arthritis. The BSR's RA register has some patients recruited in the very early years, in the first 4 to 5 years of the study. They have about 700 patients. There's a big register in Denmark that has nearly 2,500. But a lot of the existing registers focus on rheumatoid arthritis, either by design in the BSR register or by prevalence in the Denmark register. It's just there are many more people with rheumatoid arthritis. But what does this mean then? Why does this matter? Well, in rheumatoid arthritis, when looking at tender and swollen joints, there's a 28 joint count. And these registers also, of course, measure quality of life, function, fatigue, CRP, which is a measure of inflammation in the blood. But in psoriatic arthritis, yes, you want all these other things, but you need a 66 and 68 joint count. For example, in rheumatoid, which is shown on the left, they don't include the joints of the feet, which we know are frequently involved in psoriatic arthritis. So just collecting this data in, if you like, in a rheumatoid model is not enough for these patients. And of course, we also need the dactylitis, the enthesitis, the skin disease, the nail disease, and so on. So we're collecting people in the UK, patients who have a clinical diagnosis of psoriatic arthritis. They also need to meet the CASPER classification criteria. It doesn't really matter the detail of that, but it's a measure of skin disease or an indication of history of skin disease and nail disease and a few other things. Patients need to be managed in rheumatology. They need to be 16 years or older. And they need to be either starting any advanced therapy, so a biologic or a biosimilar, or that's licensed in the UK or part thereof, having not had it before, or they need to have had none of these drugs before. The reason this is slightly complicated talking about, in the UK or part thereof is really just reflecting the fact that in Scotland, some drugs are approved before they're approved in England, and sometimes it's vice versa. So it allows regional variation, and it also allows us to collect different drugs that people are being treated with in different orders. We then divide them into an exposed cohort, those people who are starting the drugs, and a non-exposed cohort. And this is not a randomized trial, so this is just down to whatever the consultant thinks is the appropriate treatment. And then people are then followed up at various time points. And if anyone in the blue group starts a drug, they transfer to the red group and have follow-up accordingly. How are we doing? Well, we have nearly 60 sites recruiting patients to the register, a site being NHS hospitals across the whole of the country. That's shown in the red, and in the blue it shows the number of participants. So we're approaching 1,000, which is fantastic. You can see in the middle of that there was an enormous slowdown in recruitment during COVID. Unfortunately, the study recruitment was one of the casualties of the pandemic. I'd love to be able to present some results from this register, but unfortunately, we're unable to. So we had an analyst in position in March 2020, downloaded the data, and we started looking at it on the 10th of March. Then, of course, there was the coronavirus pandemic on the 19th of March. Everyone in the University of Aberdeen was sent home. And actually, ultimately, our analyst left the university and has gone on to work elsewhere. We have appointed a new analyst, and we're starting work on the analysis as we speak. So hopefully we'll have some data from this soon. And this is a list of some of the research questions that we will be looking at. And just finally, just a slide or two on pulling registers together. So even large UK-wide studies are sometimes too small to answer certain questions. By pooling registers from different places, we increase sample size. By that, I mean we get more patients, more follow-up time, more statistical power, and we're able to study things that it's not possible to study on doing just a UK study. So we're able to look at rarer events, rarer exposures, things that are associated with just small increase in risk. So data from our registers is contributing to what's called the EuroSPAR collaboration. This is a collaboration of all registers, or not all perhaps, but many registers across Europe collecting data in spondyloarthritis or psoriatic arthritis. Currently 17 studies involved. Our AS data is contributing to this register. So if you contributed data to that, thank you very much. You're now part of a large, important international endeavor, and our PSA data will be contributing to that too. And just to give you an idea, here's 2 papers from PSA. We're talking now 15,000 people are now contributing to this analysis from all over Europe, which is really exciting. And we're doing science that is just not possible in a single country, which is great. So I'm going to stop there, and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you so much. I mean, that's quite an art in itself, putting quite complex science that's going on and, data gathering into accessible, understandable terms, because that was really interesting. I've got a number of questions that have popped up and ones that I've thought of as myself as listening to that. But one of the things that people watching this evening who might have PSA or might have rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis is, if they're interested, how will they know whether their rheumatology unit is contributing to the register? And if so, how can they advocate, if you like, or say, I'd like to be involved, I'd like to contribute my information into this register? How would they go about doing that?
Yeah, so thanks for that. That's an important question, and indeed we get emails not infrequently from people saying, I had one just earlier this week from a patient in Inverness who was asking if they can join the register. Unfortunately, you can only join the register if your hospital is taking part. But even if your hospital is taking part, you may not be eligible for inclusion in the register. Many people are. So if you're starting one of these new therapies, or if you've never had them before, then you would be eligible. If you're already on an advanced therapy, so something, a biologic, for example, or it could be a JAK inhibitor, any one of these new medicines. If you're already on one of those drugs and are not changing to another one, then you're not eligible to take part in the study. But of course, next time you see your consultant, if your disease has changed, you may become eligible. Then. So, as I said, we have nearly 60 sites that are currently recruiting. We're working with hospitals all over the country to try and get more sites recruiting. This is a big, important study. We will be able to answer important questions. But yes, the study is nothing without the patients contributing data.
And so when you do have somebody who has RA and PSA, and say they've already been recruited into the RA register, would it confuse matters if they were also recruited into the PSA register, or does it have to be one or the other?
No, it doesn't have to be one or the other. Certainly not as far as the PSA register is concerned. I can't speak for the RA register precisely what their inclusion criteria are, but I suspect it's similar to ours in that these are both observational studies. So studies like this tend to be divided into observational studies where the scientists are just observing what is happening in clinical care, and interventional studies where the scientists are intervening on what is happening in clinical care. So an interventional study, for example, would be a randomized trial where your treatment is determined by the fact you're in the study. And so if that is the case, then you're not a normal patient anymore, because there hasn't been a clinical decision, that has been a randomization decision. But on an observational study like a register, it may be more burdensome for you. You might be asked to fill in 2 sets of questionnaires, but there's no scientific reason why you shouldn't take part.
And I know that the data so far is yet to be fully analysed, but just from your observation of some of the material that might be coming through, is there a particular pattern? Does the psoriasis, the rash come first and then the joint involvement, or does the joint involvement start and then the rash and the psoriasis comes out after? Is there?
Yeah, so psoriatic arthritis is a strange beast, and it is possible to have psoriatic arthritis but not actually have psoriasis. But certainly for many people, the rash comes first and then the joint disease develops after. I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but certainly the risk of psoriatic arthritis increased several-fold among people with psoriasis, and a time gap of a number of years commonly.
Yeah, and so lots of people may have psoriasis and not associate then the aching joints with it, and perhaps if they're seeing a GP for their psoriasis or a dermatologist, and you might not be able to answer this not being a rheumatologist, but how knowledgeable are dermatologists and GPs of the association, that to put the two together, that here's somebody with psoriasis but they're also complaining of knee and hip and foot problems? Yeah,
so it's interesting. Actually, I was at a meeting yesterday when there was a talk by a dermatologist. There was also a talk by a gastroenterologist, because inflammatory bowel disease is not uncommon in these patients as well. And they were both advocating that in well managed patients, they would always be asked, just even if it just starts off as simple questions about how are your joints, or you're feeling a little bit achy, just to just to start asking the questions. The problem, of course, is that many people are achy. But if you ask, if there's if someone's got a disease that actually might be an arthritis, then just to start asking those questions. If the person is fine, I'm sure they will tell you. But also very often, if they're going to see a dermatologist, they feel they're going for their skin condition, and I don't want to bother the doctor with my sore fingers or my sore toes as well. This is the skin doctor. And so patients also should be encouraged to just, if they are having other symptoms, just to mention them. If the consultant you're seeing thinks it is something completely unassociated, then that's fine. Not to say it shouldn't be investigated and treated, but they consultants will join the dots, or should join the dots.
There's I'm just looking at on the Facebook chat here. There's quite a few people who have said something about having PSA and osteoarthritis, as well as some people saying they've got PSA and RA. Is there more prevalence of osteoarthritis going along with PSA, or again, is the data not quite?
Yeah, I don't actually know that. I mean, PSA and RA and indeed spondyloarthritis, are in inflammatory driven conditions. Osteoarthritis perhaps less so, but I can't really answer that, I'm afraid. I don't know enough about it.
Now, you mentioned briefly JAK inhibitors, and just for the audience listening, if they've not heard of that term before, it's another type of advanced therapies. And are the JAK inhibitors also being contributing, or are they being analysed within this data, within the register, along with the biologics, the biosimilars?
Yes, absolutely. So in the axial spondyloarthritis register, when we started recruiting to that, we were only recruiting certain drugs. It was just Enbrel and Humira, both TNF inhibitors, but biologics. That expanded, and we then had certolizumab pegol as well, and then we actually expanded that fully to open it to all drugs, although unfortunately, as I said, recruitment then stopped fairly shortly thereafter, so we really didn't get many. However, when we set up the psoriatic arthritis register, we deliberately didn't limit it to any particular agent, which is why we've said any of these advanced therapies provided you've not had it before. So that's the only criteria, and it's partly to allow us to collect more patients, to allow us to start answering questions. You know, if you don't collect the data, you can't answer the questions. But it's also reflecting the fact that this is a very busy space now. There's a lot of drugs coming on the market. There's been a lot of drug development over the last 5 or 10 years. These drugs do take a long time to come to market. Not just the biologics, and of course there are different biologics as well. But yeah, now several of these, sometimes they're called small molecule drugs as well. The JAK inhibitors, a Tesla or a Premolast is another one.
Indeed. And yeah, actually somebody's asking about how have these registers and these studies led to improvement in drugs and therapies that are available so far. So if I'm, again, you were talking about all the different drugs now that are, available, and there's such a huge, so do the pharma companies, the industries, use that data on their own drugs to improve drugs, or how does that work?
Yeah, so so there's slightly different models. So the rheumatoid arthritis register, I'm not sure about the JIA, but certainly the rheumatoid arthritis register, I think there's a model where pharmaceutical companies can have data on patients on their own drugs. This is only ever given out completely anonymously, so the companies will never find out who anybody is, but it is to allow them to interrogate the data for exactly those purposes, to say, can they identify, let's say, subgroups of patients that are seen to be responding particularly well, and that might lead to sort of reprofiling of therapies, or perhaps answering other lines of inquiry. I should just again stress, though, the anonymity of this. For the AS and PSA registers, that's not the case. Companies don't receive copies of the data, although there's been at least one occasion where a company came to us and said, actually, we're particularly interested in this question, and they asked us to do an analysis on it. So, and an example of that might be if, for example, they say, well, actually, we think our drug is particularly effective in people with severe pain, as well as other aspects of the disease. We think it's particularly effective in people with severe pain. So we're able to look at that. That might lead them to apply for different licensing or licensing in certain circumstances, and sort of lead the development of the market that way. But the other area where the registers are really beneficial is that some clinical trials of new drugs, as I mentioned, that they have highly selected patient populations. So some drugs, for example, may only be licensed for patients who have already failed a TNF inhibitor. And the license will be like that way because the randomized trial was that way. So it's only been tested in these patients. But of course, in the real world, there might be a reason a patient is not having a TNF inhibitor, and that could be many reasons. It could be that there are restrictions on how many agents people can have just because of various purchasing requirements. It may be because of certain drugs aren't recommended in certain conditions. So you say, well, actually, we don't want to give you that because you happen to have inflammatory bowel disease, or you've previously had an attack of uveitis, so we don't want to give you this. So by allowing registers to collect data on all these drugs, you're able to answer questions that clinical trials just cannot.
And that leads on to a question that I was thinking, you set, I think it was your second to last slide there, you had the various different questions, the research questions that this data will be able to hopefully answer. What sort of input do you have from patients as to what research questions they'd like answered?
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, no, so this list of questions came from a consultation exercise we had well, it was in the second half of 2019. As I said, we were hoping to
way back.
way back then,
before COVID.
Indeed. So yeah, we had the investigators of the registers. We had people from the British Society of Rheumatology. We had representation from PAPA, so the PSA charity in the UK. We had various other consultants with a specific interest, but in particular, as I said, we had patient involvement. We had several patients come along, and essentially the day was brainstorming questions. So the register was deliberately set up to be a platform to answer several or many research questions rather than just focusing on a single one. So we had essentially two sessions. What are the questions that are of interest, A, to patients and B, to doctors in this area? And then secondly is, what's the priority order? And I don't mean priority in terms of what is the most important, but priority in terms of, well, which of those the questions that we actually currently have data that we're able to answer. Mm-hmm. So some of the questions are asking about long-term outcomes. Those are things that might require 2 or 3 years worth of follow-up. Well, we're not in a position to answer that. We don't have enough people that have given us 2 to 3 years of follow-up. But if it's things like questions on, can we identify, which patients are getting the biologic therapies or getting these novel therapies? Well, actually, we've now got, as I said, approaching 1,000. Somewhere between a third and a half of our patients in the PSA register are going onto these drugs. We can say, well, actually, who are those? Are the differences? Is it, and I'm completely speculating, and this, is it that men are more likely to receive drug X, but women are more likely to receive drug Y? For example, and it's only by identifying whether there are signals like that will allow us to then explore, well, why might that be the case? Is it that men are have a slightly different disease or presenting in a slightly different way? And all those questions will start from just the initial descriptive.
And as the registers progress, and hopefully you'll recruit a lot more. I know you're not recruiting anymore for the AXPAR one, but as they can do, will you be able to add in other questions? I'm just thinking, as we're coming out of the pandemic, we hear a lot about long COVID, etc. Will there be questions that you can add in as you go along?
Definitely. I'll ask you a question back. The answer to both of them is yes. Do you mean questions that will add in to the data collection? So asking patients questions or research questions?
I'm thinking about the questions that you might be gathering from patients.
Actually, the answer
have they had COVID? How many times have they had COVID? Because we're hearing people are getting twice. Well, what reactions to the vaccines, etc. I know that's other studies are going on around that, but the long-term longitudinal data that might show us. Who knows what it might show us in the future?
Yeah, the answer is yes. So we actually did a COVID specific follow-up in starting about July 2020. So we had patients in the PSA register that were still in active follow-up. We went back to the AS register because although the study's finished, we went back to everyone who had given us their consent to be approached in future for future studies. And then we had a number of patients for a randomized control trial of something else. It was a pain study. It wasn't an inflammatory arthritis study. Mm-hmm. And we went back to those three groups and asked them things about COVID. In particular, actually, we asked them about their furlough, their activity. This was a time when we were just coming out of, but we'd had several months, people were being asked to restrict their activity, how often they went outside, how often they could go outside and take exercise. Many people were, everybody was furloughed or working at home or were a key worker. So we had, people really not taking as much exercise and moving around as they used to. And of course, exercise, mobility and activity is really good for you. A, generally, but B, especially if you have a musculoskeletal condition. And this also coincided, of course, with decreased access to healthcare. Many outpatient visits were cancelled or delayed, and so on. So we did a follow-up asking about looking at that. And now that we're still ongoing, we are now asking questions whether people have had COVID, whether they've had the vaccines, and so on, and collecting this additional information, because it's only by adding things in that we can start doing this. One of the things that's happening over time, and it happens to all studies, is that if you start off with 1,000 people at the beginning, numbers will drop off over time, and we do all that we can to try and get people to fill in these to fill in the questionnaires, and we're enormously grateful for the people who do. And one of the things that we're considering at the moment, because we want to add in other questions about COVID and so on, are there maybe things we should take out to try and keep it manageable. So those are the discussions we're having at the moment to allow us to ask these questions.
Yeah, and I think that's it. I think a lot of people probably watching tonight or watching this back as we are recording, and it will be on our YouTube channel, will be thinking, I'm forever filling in these questionnaires. They fill in questionnaires, patient reported outcome measures and things like that. And I think you're right, they start off very enthusiastic and are quite happy, but how do you feed back some of that information to those participants and again, we might, we'd love to cover this in our magazines or on our website today. I think it's important for them to see what impact their responses are having, or what it's telling people.
Yeah, so we have a number of ways. We try and send out little newsletters with questionnaires and so on. We'd be delighted to engage with NRAS or PAPA or other patient organizations about doing things like that. Getting patient and public involvement in our research is something that we've been working hard on for the last year and a half, just to really just recognizing that it's important. I think we've always known it's important, and we've always done bits of it, but what we're trying to do now is to really have a coordinated effort to try and get better at it. We've set up a patient and public involvement group, so we've now got patients with a number of diseases, patients feeding in at very early stage of studies. Actually, even before we have funding to do studies, we're now consulting with patients and getting them, helping shape the ideas, helping shape the research question. We're getting patients involved in at adapting studies. So with the PSA register, for example, we give people the option of filling in questionnaires online or on paper. And we thought that online would be more popular than it is. And so we've gone back to them and said, what are we getting wrong with this? And so they've given us really helpful, just user feedback about the quality of how we're collecting data and what works and what doesn't, and so on. And we're also, we're producing sort of plain English summaries of all our output, which we're putting on our website, and I'm happy to share the link. So every time we publish a scientific paper, which people like me think is really interesting and exciting, I totally understand it can be a little bit dry for patients. So we're trying to produce short, maybe one page or even just a couple of paragraphs, or sometimes it's a little video or an infographic rather than a written summary, just summarizing the results of the papers, because I think it's the right thing to do. We rely on patients filling in these questionnaires to give us the data, to allow us to answer the questions. It's the right thing to do to give it back to them and say, actually, thank you. This is what this research has shown.
Absolutely. And I love infographics. A good infographic can tell you a lot in a very real quick moment. The two more questions before I let you get back to your evening, and I really appreciate you taking so much time to spend with us. With rheumatoid arthritis, of course, we heard last year that the NICE has reduced the threshold for accessing some of the biologic medication. So, of course, there'll be people with moderate disease perhaps being recruited into the biologics register for rheumatoid arthritis. Is that going to be similar in PSA? Is there a similar threshold, and are you seeing more people being able to access some of the biologics or advanced therapies at an earlier stage of their disease?
Yeah, so there's recently the BSR has updated its guidelines on treatment of PSA with these advanced therapies. EULAR and GRAPPA, two international organizations, have updated their guidelines as well, and they're all coming out with sort of similar messages, and I mean, I don't think all of them are necessarily even fully published yet, but there's definitely has been a shift. I mean, these drugs have been, well, some of these drugs are brand new, of course, but biologic therapies have been around now for 20 years. And notwithstanding that any drug can have adverse safety issues, I think that the concern that we had 20 years ago about the safety of these drugs, I think has gone away. They are now widely used and widely considered to be safe, and we're in a really exciting space, especially in PSA. There's so many drugs attacking so many different sort of molecular targets, different parts of the biology of the disease, and so a lot of the guidelines now are trying to give advice on when certain agents should be used. 20 years ago, there was 2 or 3 of these, all targeting the same thing. There wasn't much choice. Now in PSA, there are the tens. I don't know how many, but there are loads of agents attacking different parts of the pathway. And I think and the treating physicians have the option. They're more weapons in their armory. They have the option of trying different things, and we're only now sort of starting to learn that, oh, this patient looks like this drug would work best, whereas this patient looks like this drug would work best, for a variety of different reasons. And I think it's only going to get more precise, and that move to this precision medicine, I think, is the way we're going.
It's incredibly exciting. And just for those of you watching who are interested in the BSR the RA register data, we do host some of the lay summaries already on our website on RA, and again, once we have some lay summaries from the PSA register, we'd be delighted to host them on our website as well. Now, a very tricky question that's popped in, and it did cross my mind as well, but you mentioned about how the register, the PSA register, is linking with the European registers as well. Has Brexit made a difference to these sorts of trials and data sharing and collaboration between European studies and UK studies?
Brexit will have definitely had an impact in some way on science. Movement of people, for example, may be one of them. But actually, for this, no, I think it's okay. For the Eurospar collaboration, so as I said, PSA data we're not yet contributing it, mainly because we haven't really had a proper thorough look at the data ourselves yet. We're only just starting that now. But the AXPAR data, we do contribute that. It's hosted by a data center in Copenhagen with some very, very clever IT people. the issues are less to do with Brexit and more to do with the consent and permissions for which we hold the data. So, for example, I can tell you that data from the UK has been submitted to Copenhagen, has been analysed by teams in Switzerland, by teams in Spain, by teams in Finland, but the data never leaves Copenhagen. So it's done in a way, in a it's called a safe haven model, and indeed, actually, in Aberdeen, we are also accessing data from about 14 of these different registers, and it's done in a way that the Copenhagen system is secure. So we only contribute our data. Well, you only contribute the data that's at the minimum that's required to answer the research question, and then it never leaves that environment.
And again, it is all anonymized.
It's
anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all anonymized. I mean, even in Aberdeen, some of the people listening to this, I'm sure, will have contributed data to the studies. Even if you told me your name, I wouldn't know whether you were in the study or not. I only know you by an ID number, and even though I think you might be 25,051, the data that goes to Copenhagen, you could be number one. So no two analysts receive the same ID numbers. It's all very protected, partly because of just genuine data confidentiality and consent and GDPR and all that sort of stuff. It's just good practice to do it. And partly the threat of doing it wrong means that people will stop contributing data. We'll stop being able to answer these questions. And so it's all highly secure.
So
at the moment, Brexit is not a problem.
So I do hope that really encourages many of you that are watching this evening or watching it back as a recording to consider, getting involved in be it the PSA register, the RA register, or any other study that your clinicians might approach you about. It's vitally important for more participation, so that we get this real world evidence and real experience of what it's like to live with RA, PSA, or AS. There are a couple of questions that I can quickly answer. Somebody's asked about, is baricitinib a biologic? It is an advanced therapy. It isn't a biologic because it's a different molecule, and it works in a different way. So it's not an injectable, it's a tablet form. So it's a smaller molecule. Is that a good synopsis, Gareth?
Yeah, I think so. So the reason some of these drugs are called biologics is essentially down to how they're made. They are I think of it like brewing a beer almost. You get an organism like a yeast, and it then produces the alcohol you want, and these molecules are enormous, but it is a biological process, which is why they're called biologics, as opposed to the small molecules, which is essentially a bit more of a chemical process that is made in a laboratory.
Yes, but thank you very much. And the other question that somebody's asked about, well, it's not a question so much, they've been on methotrexate since March for their PSA and they're having terrible side effects. Are the injections better? Well, many people do find the side effects lessen with the subcutaneous injections of methotrexate. So it's worth having a conversation with your rheumatologist about that. But also, methotrexate can take about 12 weeks to really kick in and start working. So it could be that the side effects will reduce. But have that conversation with your specialist nurse or with your rheumatologist if you've got concerns, and ask them about the injections if you want to give them a go. And again, you can always phone NRAS. We're here to help on our helpline. If you want to talk to somebody else who perhaps has been on those injections for a while to know what it's like, again, we've got wonderful telephone support volunteers are here for you, volunteers, so we can put you in touch with someone to just have that bit of a chat before you make that commitment if you want. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Gareth after a busy day at work, spending the time sharing that fantastic information with us. This will be recorded, or has been recorded, so it will be available on our YouTube channel at a later date. Next month, the last Wednesday of every month, we have another Facebook Live, and I believe the next one is about osteoporosis. Again, a very key topic for those with RA. Love to see you again then. Thank you very much, Gareth. Have a nice evening, and everybody stay safe, and hope you're getting all your spring boosters. Take care. Good night.